So good morning. I stand before you this morning from a position of privilege. First of all, the privilege of being able to see. For 11 years, my husband and I took care of my father, who was legally blind, and that gave me a great deal of understanding of what it means to not be able to see, and a great deal of appreciation for the privilege that I have of being able to see. The privilege of hearing. And I've also realized in this time of masking how much my hearing also depends upon seeing the speaker, seeing lip reading, you would call it. Another understanding of how our senses are connected. Another one of the privileges is that we speak a common language, that I understand you, you understand me. Our words help us to know each other. And then, of course, there's the privilege that you see when you look at me that I am a white person. A great privilege. A couple of months ago, I finally gave in to the idea that I really needed a different cell phone. Mine was clearly dying. And so I went shopping and found what I thought was a deal where I could essentially get a new phone for free. Yes, so I got this new phone. It didn't cost me very much more than the other one was costing. But then there was learning how to use it. Something that probably would have been intuitive to anybody 10 years older or younger, and yet to me, being 8 times that age, a real challenge. Especially something like how to turn on the flashlight. Now, I know that you can learn anything by going onto YouTube, but I'm just too stubborn and pig-headed to do that. So I took my fancy schmancy device over into a corner where I could sit there with it and figure and puzzle and stroke this way and push that way, and I finally figured it out. Of course, simple when you know what you're doing, really simple. I still recommend keeping battery-operated flashlights around, just in case. Now, as you learned from Mary, who has pretty much said everything I was going to say this morning. Yes, great minds, all right. Anyhow, here in the northern hemisphere, this planet has been tipping slightly away from the sun for almost 6 months now. In northern New England, in Maine, for instance, we start noticing those shorter days and longer nights, even in the month of August. You wouldn't think that would be so important, and it isn't that important here in San Diego, but in Maine, you start noticing those shorter days, even in the month of August. Now, this business of tipping away from the sun and tipping towards the sun has been happening long before Hallmark cards ever had marketing opportunities, and long before humans were creating calendars or even written language, long before we even emerged from the primordial slime. But once human communities began to track what was going on, it seemed to them like the movement of the sun, this event, this shorter days, this really became a focus of their stories because it was so important. It looked to them like the sun was leaving them. Its warmth was getting less and less. The angle of the sun to the earth, which they could tell by shadows, it was changing and something was wrong. And as far as they knew at that time, this was going to continue. The darkness was going to continue to grow. So imagine how scary that must have been. So once human communities started to put together what they were observing, this observation became the focus of their stories. And of course, as Mary said, if you lived in the southern hemisphere, we're talking about an opposite season. But here in the northern hemisphere, long nights, chillier times. Now, if you lived, say, in southern Chile, you'd be having nearly 24 hours of daylight. I remember once when my husband and I were in Iceland for the summer solstice, and we were staying at a bed and breakfast, and I remember waking up and having bright sunlight in the room and thinking, oh my gosh, we've overslept, we've missed our bus. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. That's a really strange feeling, but that's what it's like to live in the place where you're looking at 24-hour daylight. Now, this time of year, if you lived near or north of the Arctic Circle, you would be looking at 24-hour darkness. Imagine that. Nighttime for days and weeks. Flashlight time for sure. How can this not be an emotional, spiritual experience? Now, what appeared to our pre-scientific ancestors as facts, like the sun moving away and life perhaps ending, we millennia later hopefully have learned a few things. And we know that this process of the shortening days and the lengthening nights will not go on forever. We know that the days will become longer, and the warmth of the sun will, before long, have us complaining about it once again. So, with our scientific knowledge, the winter solstice really isn't such a big deal, especially not here in Southern California. We're in the season of holidays where we're celebrating light with candles and decorations and everything twinkling and sparkling and stories. And we tell stories based on what we've gathered from our cultures. We repeat these stories over and over and over again until they take on the weight of truth. We create rituals to amplify them, to validate, to reinforce them. And of course, stories evolve. They take on and they cast off. If you're searching for the one true, authentic, real story, you may be searching for a long time. I remember when I was taking mythological studies in grad school, how frustrating and fascinating it was to learn how there was this fluid nature of stories. You could not pin down the real one. There are as many versions of stories as there are of storytellers. And you know, we get into trouble when we attempt to set our particular story as, well, we might have said carved in stone. Nowadays it would be more like set into resin. If we say, well, my story is the right one, the real one, and then we try to seal in permanently behavior or even ways of believing or imagination, it's a problem. But this is not to say that we humans do not need guidelines or principles. Goodness, we certainly do. But we also know that we need to be as careful as we possibly can when we create boundaries, that they allow for those inevitable pushes and pulls of our understandings. We need to remember that what we understood 50 years ago or even 25 years ago is a whole lot different from what's now. When my mother was in her prime as a homemaker, for instance, a Jell-O salad was one of the centerpieces of a proper dinner. Not anymore. Food trends. Seems like a fairly innocuous subject, but if you think about it, There have been and continue to be pushes and pulls, even in our own family cultures. Of course, all of us have been exposed and continue to be exposed to levels of technology in the past 19 months, a topic many of us could barely imagine would have affected us so personally. There have been shifts in our experiences, shifts in our scientific knowledge, and certainly shifts on a planetary level. We've observed melting glaciers, the increasing intensity of storms, droughts, tornadoes, fires, and on a planetary level, except for watching the news, these may not seem to affect us directly. Yet, if we understand ourselves to be part of this Earth community, passengers on this blue boat home, there is no way any of us can be exempt. Just as there is no way any of us can be exempt from the messy or ugly or, as Greg Boyd put it a couple weeks ago, the evil actions of our human history. We all have ancestors or we wouldn't be here. And we bear the complicity of the actions of those ancestors for good as well as for evil, with the assumptions that we inherited. Speaking for myself, as a descendant of white European Christian culture, even missionary culture, there is a heavy burden of the colonizer. The assumption of God-supported righteousness for whatever oppressive action was taken. And there was no shortage of oppressive action. I wonder if any of you remember the words some of us sang in Protestant churches in something that was called the Gloria Patri. As it was in the beginning, it is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Amen. That was sung every Sunday morning in the Methodist church where I grew up. Talk about assumptions. How, I used to wonder, before I even knew what the word subversive was, could anyone be so sure of that? It was no idea what it was really like in the beginning. How could we know that what was now always would be? And what made us so positive that the world would never end? As a kid, these were thoughts I kept to myself. But years later, when I came upon Greek mythology and Asian and African creation stories and legends of the first peoples of this continent, sagas of Iceland, I began to feel something shift deeply. If people from widely divergent communities created stories based on their understanding of their world, their geography, their climate, their cultural patterns, why couldn't I use my imagination to step outside of this Christian righteousness to retell stories that made the most sense to me and create some rituals to honor them? Did I have any right to do this? Would some enrobed bishop or Zeus or Thor slap me down for my arrogance? Well, it seemed to me I had the gifts and the privilege and the opportunity to give it a try. Winter solstice, the darkest time of the year, was what I wanted to honor. With a team of helpers, we created a kind of performance ritual on the accommodating campus of UU Church in Hillcrest. I think it was 1996. We set up seats in a large circle to mimic a community gathering around a storyteller, We created colorful banners, and we draped the campus in tiny, sparkling lights. We served hot spiced cider to warm folks while they waited for the procession to start. And then musicians and storytellers and dancers started singing wassail, 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 and bring the solstice round, and everybody marched into their seats. We learned from the woman who had taught the concept back in Connecticut how to do theater in the round. Do any of you recall Bernice Clark, then well into her 80s, coming out there dressed in black tights and a long fringed shawl and telling her grandmother's spider stories? We searched for multicultural musicians and dancers and told stories from far outside our culture. We referenced familiar songs, but shifted the words, shifted the focus, and raised the energy from skeptical curiosity to genuine enthusiasm. Our drummers who had traveled from Los Angeles went out onto the patio and spontaneously continued to drum for another 40 minutes while everyone followed them outside and danced and danced and danced well into the night. Oh, how I miss that. I imagine the Hillcrest neighborhood wondered what those nut jobs over there were doing. And each year, for 21 years or maybe even more, the patio drumming was part of the winter solstice, that festival held at First Church campus, probably much to the consternation of the neighborhood. My UU friend, Shelley Jackson Denham, wrote a lovely song that is published in our gray hymnal. She called it Dark of Winter. I want to share her words with you. Dark of winter, soft and still, your quiet calm surrounds me. Let my thoughts go where they will, ease my mind profoundly. And then my soul will sing a song, a blessed song of love eternal. Gentle darkness, soft and still, bring your quiet to me. Darkness, soothe my weary eyes that I may see more clearly. And when my heart with sorrow cries, comfort and caress me. And then my soul may hear a voice, a still, small voice of love eternal. Darkness, when my fears arise, let your peace flow through me. These past several years have been filled with anxiety for most of us. No getting around it. The isolation, the losses, the fear of what could happen next, the stresses of doing without, and facing changes and events we could never have imagined. It goes on, and it is deep. And while we dearly like to be done with it, we know it might take us a generation to recover from what we have been through. And while we are recovering, while it seems to be taking a terribly long time, pushing a very large boulder up a hill, let us listen to some whose artistry leans towards healing. Young Black poet Amanda Gorman inspired Leah Morris to write her beautiful anthem, the anthem you heard her sing at the beginning of this talk. You'll hear the Orange Coast UU virtual choir sing it again. The darkest times may bring out our greatest powers of creativity. Seems to me that's what Shelley Jackson had in mind when she wrote her hymn. And I think it is where poet May Sarton was coming from when she wrote the words I'll use in closing today. I think we would do well to remember that seeds need time to rest in the dark soil of earth before they reach for the light. As plants renew their cycle after a time of darkness, so too do we need a time of rest, a time of recovery, in order to come back and be able to bravely be the light.